Welcome back. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. Let the lights go low. Tonight we are going to settle in with one of the most interesting and quietly heartbreaking stories in the history of animated television. The story of a show that was born brilliant, killed twice, resurrected by sheer force of fan devotion, and then slowly, painfully, season by season, became a shadow of the thing that people had loved so completely they refused to let it die. This is the story of Family Guy. But more than that, it is the story of what happens when something great stops being cared for. When the people responsible for keeping a flame burning get distracted by other fires, and the original light quietly begins to dim. So settle in. This one is long, it is thorough, and it is going to take you through every era, every turning point, and every quiet moment where something precious slipped away. Let us begin at the very beginning. Section 1. The Golden Age. What made Family Guy extraordinary. Seasons 1 through 3, 1999 to 2002. The year was 1999. The world was nervous about Y2K, the internet was a blinking cursor on a dial-up modem, and a young man named Seth McFarland had just convinced a major American television network to give him an animated series based on 2 short films he had made while still in school. McFarland had studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, a place with a beautiful, almost mythic reputation for producing artists who see the world in ways most people cannot. While he was still a student there, he created a thesis film called The Life of Larry, which featured a middle-aged man named Larry and his talking dog Steve. A few years after graduating, when he was working as an animator for Hanna-Barbera on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory, he made a sequel called Larry and Steve. These 2 short films were rough, funny, and unmistakably personal. Larry was a lovable fool who meant well but stumbled through life in spectacular fashion. Steve was sharp, dry, and endlessly patient with his human companion. Executives at Fox saw the shorts. They made a phone call. In May of 1998, McFarland walked into Fox's offices and pitched a 15-minute pilot for a new animated series. The budget they gave him for that pilot was $50,000. He was 24 years old. The show was called Family Guy. Fox greenlit it. McFarland took Larry and Steve, renamed them Peter and Brian, built a family around them, set them in a fictional Rhode Island town, and created something that had never quite existed before on American television. The series premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. Denver had beaten Atlanta 34-19 that day, and millions of Americans who had been parked on their sofas since kickoff were still there when Family Guy began. The first episode, called Death Has a Shadow, pulled in 22 million viewers. For context, that is more people than the entire current population of Australia, tuning in to watch Peter Griffin lose his job at a toy factory, accidentally collect an enormous welfare check, and then dump the cash from a blimp over the Super Bowl crowd. It was irreverent, strange, a little rough around the edges, and completely unlike anything else on television. The show that McFarland had built centered on the Griffin family living in a fictional town in Rhode Island. You had Peter, the overweight, good-natured, frequently confused patriarch who worked first at the Pawtucket Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Factory and later at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, a man who loved beer, loved bad television, and whose heart was almost always in the right place even when his brain decidedly was not. Lois was his wife, red-haired and sharp-eyed, a woman who had married somewhat below her social station and was constantly performing the emotional labor of keeping the household from collapsing. She played piano, she tried to reason with Peter, and she loved her family with a kind of bone-deep patience that was quietly heroic. Their 3 children were Meg, the oldest, an ordinary teenage girl navigating the particular misery of high school with no social advantages and no remarkable gifts. Just a quiet longing to be noticed and liked. Chris, the middle child, was overweight like his father, slow-moving in thought but sweet in spirit. a boy who drew pictures and watched too much television and bumbled through adolescence with endearing clumsiness. And then there was Stewie. Stewie Griffin was 1 year old. He sat in a high chair and ate strained peas and wore a yellow shirt and a triangular head. He also spoke in a refined British accent that sounded like a Bond villain who had attended Oxford and enjoyed cruelty as a hobby. He built ray guns in his bedroom. He constructed mind control devices. He plotted endlessly against Lois, his mother, fantasizing about her destruction, with the patient intensity of a man who has been wronged and intends to settle the score. His primary life goals in Season 1 were, in order, to kill Lois Griffin and to conquer the known world. And then there was Brian, the family dog, a white Labrador who walked on 2 legs, drank dry martinis, drove a second-hand Toyota Prius, and was by considerable margin the most intelligent and self-aware member of the entire household. Brian had read the books he talked about. He had opinions that were his own. He was a failed writer who nursed a novel that never quite got finished, a man-dog caught between the world of instincts he could not entirely suppress and the intellectual ambitions he could not quite fulfill. He was the voice of reason, the dry observer, the friend who watched Peter make terrible decisions and tried, usually in vain, to redirect the outcome. The dynamic this created was extraordinary. You had a clownish patriarch, a patient wife, a misunderstood daughter, a sweet-natured son, a murderous baby, and a philosophical dog. Every one of these characters occupied a specific emotional space in the family ecosystem, and every one of them bounced off the others in ways that created comedy that felt earned rather than manufactured. What people talk about least when they discuss the early seasons of Family Guy is how much warmth was present. The show was loud, frequently offensive by the standards of the Parents Television Council, which listed it among the worst primetime programs for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006, and genuinely sharp in its satirical edge. But underneath all of that, the Griffins liked each other. Not in a saccharine sitcom way where every episode ended with a hug and a lesson. More in the way of people who are genuinely stuck with each other and have discovered that stuck is actually fine. Because the people you are stuck with are, when it comes down to it, the people you would choose. Peter would do something catastrophic, realize he had done something catastrophic, and then try to make it right. That cycle, the mess and the accountability and the repair, was the emotional engine of early Family Guy. And it worked. Because Peter was never written as someone who did not care. He was written as someone who cared enormously, but could not always translate that caring into responsible behavior. The humor in those first 3 seasons had a specific texture to it. Yes, there were cutaway gags. Family Guy did not invent the cutaway, but it made the form its own, and from the very first episode, the show would cut away from the main story to a brief tangentially connected comedic scene before cutting back. A character would say something like, "This reminds me of the time," and then the screen would jump to some ridiculous scenario that had nothing to do with the plot, play out for a few seconds, and return. It was quick. It was efficient. It was additive rather than substitutive. The story kept moving. The cutaways were the seasoning on the meal, not the meal itself. More importantly, the jokes in those early seasons had density. They were written for people who were paying attention. References came fast and from unexpected angles. The show drew on film history, American political culture, 70s and 80s nostalgia, and the specific absurdity of suburban domestic life in ways that rewarded viewers who could keep up. The humor was dark, but it was dark in the way that good dark comedy is dark, which is to say it was using uncomfortable material to reveal something true rather than simply shocking people for the sake of a reaction. The writing staff McFarland assembled for those original seasons was genuinely talented. Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman and Mike Barker formed the core of a room that understood what the show was trying to do and how to do it. And McFarland himself was not just the creator and the voice of four main characters. He was in the room. He was reading the scripts. He was present at every stage of production, shaping the jokes and the stories with a specific creative vision that gave the show a unified aesthetic voice. You could feel that someone cared when you watched those early episodes. Not in a precious or defensive way, just in the way that distinguishes Workmade with genuine investment from Workmade to fill a schedule. The show had a point of view. It had a specific sense of humor that belonged to someone, rather than a collection of comedy techniques assembled by committee. The first season ranked number 33 in the Nielsen ratings with 12.8 million households watching regularly. For a new animated comedy on a broadcast network, those were solid numbers. The show had found an audience. And then Fox did what Fox did. The network's relationship with Family Guy during its original run was, by any reasonable assessment, catastrophic for the show. In the second season, Fox moved the series to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, which placed it directly opposite NBC's Frasier, one of the most beloved and highly rated comedies on American television at the time. The ratings dropped sharply. Fox then moved the show to Tuesday nights at 8:30, where it competed with the phenomenon of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, a game show that was eating everything else in its time slot alive. The ratings dropped again. Then came the third season, where Fox moved the show to Thursday nights at 8 in the evening, placing it against Friends and the explosive early success of Survivor on CBS. The show was outgunned on every side. The network had essentially taken a show with a genuine audience and made it nearly impossible for that audience to reliably find. Viewers tried to follow, but the constant shuffling meant that people would sit down to watch and discover something else in Family Guy's place, or tune into the wrong night entirely. By the time the third season ended in February of 2002, Fox had had enough. The network canceled Family Guy for the second and final time. The decision was made quietly, without ceremony. The show that had debuted to 22 million viewers was done. Or so everyone thought. But there is something worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward, because the quality of those 3 seasons is really the standard against which everything that follows gets measured. Seasons 1 through 3 of Family Guy were genuinely good television, not good for an animated comedy, not good for a Fox show, just good. The characters were specific and fully realized. The humor was intelligent and layered. The emotional core was warm without being sentimental, and the whole thing felt like the work of someone who was excited about what he was making. That version of Family Guy, the one where Peter loved his family and meant well and was held accountable when he fell short, the one where Brian was genuinely smart and genuinely loyal, the one where Stewie was a terrifying, hilarious genius who plotted the downfall of Western civilization from. His crib? That version existed for 3 seasons and 3 seasons only, and when the show came back from cancellation, it would never quite be that version again. But before we talk about what the show became, we should talk about the extraordinary thing that happened in the 3 years between cancellation and revival. Because that story is, in many ways, just as interesting as the show itself. And hey, before we go any further, drop a comment below and let me know where and when you were watching this. Time zones, cities, middle of the night, early morning with a cup of something warm. I want to know, and if this is the kind of content you come back to, a subscribe costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need somewhere quiet to land. Right. Let's continue. Section 2. The Cancellation, the Cult, and the Resurrection. 2002 to 2005. When Family Guy was canceled in 2002, nobody expected what happened next. The conventional wisdom about canceled television shows is simple and almost always accurate. They die. A network pulls the plug. The cast moves on. The writers scatter to other projects, and within a year or two, the show becomes a memory that devoted fans carry around quietly. The kind of thing that comes up at certain conversations and prompts someone to say, "Oh, I loved that show. That was so good. What happened to it?" And the answer is always the same thing. It got canceled. That is what happened to it. Family Guy was supposed to follow that trajectory. Fox had canceled it twice. The second time with what appeared to be finality. There was no last-minute reprieve. No streaming service waiting in the wings. No competing network with a rescue deal. The show was done. But then something happened that changed the entire television industry's understanding of how audiences and content could interact. Cartoon Network bought the syndication rights to Family Guy. According to reporting from the period, the network acquired those rights for almost nothing, because Fox had tried to sell them elsewhere and found essentially no interest. Nobody thought a canceled animated comedy from a broadcast network was worth much on the open market. Cartoon Network, specifically its Adult Swim late-night block, disagreed. Adult Swim had launched in September of 2001 as a late-night programming block on Cartoon Network aimed at adults, running from roughly 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning. The original lineup included shows like Space Ghost Coast to Coast, Sea Lab 2021, and Aqua Teen Hunger Force, which were cheap, strange, and genuinely unlike anything on television. The block had found a devoted following among late-night viewers, particularly college students and young adults who appreciated animation that was not designed for children and did not apologize for being weird. Family Guy premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. What happened next was almost immediate. The show became the highest-rated program on the entire block. Not one of the most popular shows. The highest-rated. According to reporting from Entertainment Weekly, it dominated late-night viewing in its time period against both cable and broadcast competition. Within months, the Adult Swim block's overall viewership had increased by 239%. 239%. Because of reruns of a canceled show that a broadcast network had given away for almost nothing. At the same time, Fox released the DVD sets for the first and second seasons of Family Guy, timing the release to coincide with the Adult Swim premiere. The timing could not have been better. People watching the reruns on Adult Swim wanted more. They went looking for more and found it on DVD. The first and second season sets sold 400,000 copies within the first month. Within the year, total sales reached 2.2 million copies, making Family Guy the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and, at the time, the second highest-selling television DVD in history, trailing only the first season of Chappelle's Show on Comedy Central. People were not just watching the show, they were buying it. They were recommending it to friends. They were building communities around it. This was before YouTube, before TikTok, before streaming platforms, before the modern viral infrastructure that we take for granted now. The cult following for Family Guy was being built through word of mouth, through DVD lending, through late-night cable viewing, through the particular kind of enthusiasm that forms around something people feel they discovered rather than were sold. Fox noticed. Of course, Fox noticed. The network that had canceled the show twice and sold the syndication rights for almost nothing was suddenly watching Family Guy become a cultural phenomenon from the sidelines. In May of 2004, Fox made the decision that made television history. They ordered 35 new episodes of Family Guy, becoming the first network ever to revive a show based primarily on DVD sales. The fourth season would premiere in 2005. Family Guy was coming back. The fan reaction was, to put it mildly, euphoric. This was a show that people had loved and mourned and refused to let go of. a show they had kept alive through purchasing habits and passionate conversation at a time when neither networks nor studios were particularly interested in what audiences thought about canceled programming. The revival felt like a victory that belonged to the fans in a way that almost no other television event had ever felt. The audience had not just watched a show, they had saved it. The premiere of the fourth season on May 1st, 2005 was a significant event. Fox placed Family Guy at the center of their Sunday night animation domination lineup, airing it alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new McFarland creation called American Dad, which had debuted just a few months earlier in February. The return episode, called North by North Quahog, pulled in roughly 11.87 million viewers according to various reports from the period. It was the highest-rated Family Guy episode since the first season. The audience had been real, and it had waited 3 years to come back. But here is the thing about gaps. When a show goes away for 3 years, it does not come back exactly as it left. Time passes for the people who make a show just as it passes for the people who watch it. Writers move on. Animators move on. The specific energy that existed in a writing room at a particular moment in time cannot be perfectly reconstructed after a 3-year hiatus. New people come in. Different sensibilities arrive. The show that returns is always, at least slightly, a different show than the one that left. McFarland acknowledged this directly and repeatedly in interviews over the years. One of the consequences of Family Guy being pulled off the air so often, he noted, was that they were constantly having to re-staff writers. Each cancellation sent the writing staff scattering. When the show came back in 2005, the room was not the same room that had made seasons 1 through 3. Some of the original voices were absent. New voices had arrived, and while new writers are not automatically a problem, the specific alchemy of a writing room is almost impossible to recreate once it has been disrupted. The show that came back was still recognizably Family Guy. The characters were there. The Griffin household looked the same. The voice cast, McFarland doing Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, Alex Borstein as Lois, Seth Green as Chris, Mila Kunis as Meg, was intact and performing beautifully. The cutaway gag format was still present. But something was already shifting, almost imperceptibly in the weeks and months of that fourth season. The animation looked slightly different, cleaner in some ways and stiffer in others. The jokes were coming at a different rate and from different angles. Peter was doing things that the season 1 Peter would not quite have done. Stewie was beginning, just beginning, to move away from his defining characteristic. None of these changes were catastrophic yet. Seasons 4 and 5 of Family Guy are still, by most assessments, good television. There are memorable episodes scattered throughout both seasons. The talent was still present. The show was still funny. But the direction had begun to shift, and the shift had a destination that nobody was entirely ready for. Section 3. The First Cracks. The Revival Years. Seasons 4 and 5, 2005 to 2007. There is a particular kind of nostalgia for the early revival seasons of Family Guy that tends to be complicated. People who grew up watching the show often point to season 4 or 5 as their point of entry. The seasons that made them fans before they went back and discovered the earlier material. For those viewers, the revival era is the real version of the show, the one they fell in love with first, and they are not wrong to love it. There is genuine quality in those seasons, genuine comedy, genuinely memorable moments. But for people who had been watching from the beginning, for the viewers who had loved seasons 1 through 3 and spent 3 years watching Adult Swim reruns and buying the DVD sets and keeping the flame alive, the revival felt simultaneously wonderful and slightly off. like meeting an old friend after years apart and realizing that the changes you expected to be superficial are actually a little deeper than that. The most immediately noticeable change in Season 4 was the animation. In the original 3 seasons, the show had a handmade quality to it. The characters moved in a way that felt organic and expressive. Film Roman had provided animation for the first season, and while they departed due to what was described as production differences, the subsequent seasons had that handcrafted energy that early animated comedies carried when the technical limitations of the medium were still visible in a charming, rather than distracting way. Rough Draft Studios, which handled seasons 2 and 3, gave the show a particularly lively and expressive visual quality that fans responded to with real enthusiasm. When the show returned for Season 4, a different animation sensibility was in place. The lines were sharper, the outlines thicker, the colors more saturated. In purely technical terms, the production was more polished, but something was lost in the translation. The characters moved with less spontaneity. The comedy of Peter falling or Brian reacting could not land quite as well when the physical animation was more precise and less free. It is a subtle thing, the way animation quality affects the emotional experience of watching a cartoon, but it is real. Comedy is physical. Timing is everything. When the body movements of a character change, the jokes land differently. But animation was the smaller issue. The bigger issue was already in the writing. The cutaway gags, which had always been a feature of Family Guy but had functioned in seasons 1 through 3 as a bonus layer of comedy on top of a solid story foundation, began to grow. Not dramatically, not overnight, but noticeably. Episodes started to lean on them more heavily. The ratio between story time and cutaway time began to shift. Plots grew slightly thinner, slightly more skeletal, as the writing room discovered that the cutaway format could fill time and generate laughs without requiring the kind of careful story construction that the early seasons had demanded. It is worth being specific about why this matters, because the cutaway gag format itself is not inherently a weakness. In fact, when Family Guy used it well, it was one of the most innovative comedy tools on television. The cutaway works beautifully when it is short, when it is surprising, when it connects back to something in the scene in a way that rewards attention. When a character compares a situation to something absurd, and the cutaway shows that absurdity with perfect comedic timing, it is a genuine delight. The early seasons were full of those delights. But the cutaway format contains a structural temptation that is very hard to resist over time. Because the jokes are self-contained, because they do not require any connection to plot or character, they are the easiest kind of comedy to produce. You can write 50 cutaway jokes in an afternoon. Writing a story that is funny from beginning to end, that builds and pays off in ways that feel organic, that develops characters while also generating laughs, that is hard work. And as a writing staff deals with the pressure of producing 22 episodes per season, the temptation to fill time with cutaways rather than stories is constant. In seasons 4 and 5, the show had not yet given in to that temptation entirely. But the gravitational pull was there. And you could feel it. Peter Griffin in season 4 was still mostly the Peter of the early seasons. He was still dumb, still well-meaning, still the kind of father who might accidentally destroy something his children cared about but would at least feel bad about it afterward. But the writers were beginning to push his stupidity to new extremes, reaching for bigger and more outlandish examples of his cluelessness. In the original run, Peter's foolishness was grounded in recognizable human behavior. He was the kind of man who exists, perhaps in exaggerated form, but whose failures are the failures of real people. Failures of impulse control and short-term thinking and the inability to see consequences before they arrive. In the revival, his intelligence began dropping in ways that were harder to recognize as anything but cartoon exaggeration. He started doing things not because he was a lovable idiot, but because the writers needed something absurd to happen. The difference is important. And it is subtle. Lovable stupidity is relatable. Cartoon stupidity is just loud. Brian's transformation was already beginning, too, though it was quieter at this stage. In the early seasons, Brian's liberal politics were one ingredient in a fully realized character. He had opinions. He had failures. He had longing. The politics were just part of who he was. The way a real person might be passionate about certain issues without those issues consuming their entire personality. In Season 4 and into Season 5, the politics started taking up more space. More scenes devoted to Brian expressing views. More moments where the dialogue felt less like character interaction and more like the writers using Brian as a vehicle for commentary. It was subtle enough that most viewers barely noticed it, but in hindsight it reads as the beginning of a much larger problem. Stewie was changing most visibly of all, and unlike Peter and Brian, the change in Stewie was the result of a conscious creative decision rather than gradual drift. McFarland and the writing staff had come to feel that the evil baby format had been pushed as far as it could reasonably go. The premise of a murderous infant plotting world domination was something they felt they had explored from every angle available to them. They wanted to do something different with the character. So, starting in Season 4, they began redirecting Stewie's personality. The elaborate schemes became less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life slowed considerably. The weapons laboratory and the bedroom started appearing less. In their place came a softer, more emotionally exploratory version of the character. One who was more interested in his friendship with Brian. More curious about his own identity. More openly vulnerable in ways that the original evil genius version never had been. Not all of this was bad. The Brian and Stewie friendship that developed out of this shift became one of the best things the show produced in its middle and later years. The Road to episodes in which Brian and Stewie embarked on themed adventures together were consistently the strongest episodes of whatever season they appeared in. There was genuine chemistry between the characters, genuine comedy in their contrasting personalities, and genuine warmth in their affection for each other. But the trade-off was real. What the show gained in the Brian and Stewie dynamic it lost in the terrifying originality of early Stewie. There was only one evil genius baby on American television, and he was being quietly retired. Seasons 4 and 5 also contained some extraordinary individual episodes that demonstrated how much talent was still present when the show was operating at full capacity. The Season 5 premiere, Stewie Loves Lois, presented a radically different dynamic between the baby and his mother, and was widely praised by fans and critics. Road to Rupert, another Brian and Stewie adventure, was genuinely excellent. Barely Legal, the episode where Meg develops feelings for Brian after he takes her to prom out of kindness, was sharp and character-driven in a way that recalled the best of the early seasons. These episodes proved something important. The ability was still there. The writing room was still capable of excellence when it chose to pursue it. The characters could still be used with skill and care. The humor could still be genuinely intelligent. But the treatment of Meg Griffin, the family's oldest daughter, was already beginning to escalate in ways that would become deeply uncomfortable. In the early seasons, Meg was the boring one. The least remarkable member of a family full of remarkable people, and the comedy of her situation came from the relatable experience of feeling invisible in your own family. The jokes were gentle and grounded in something true. Teenagers everywhere understood the feeling of being the unremarkable sibling, and Meg's particular brand of quiet suffering was recognizable. Starting in Season 4 and intensifying in Season 5, the jokes about Meg shifted from her being uninteresting to her being ugly. Her physical appearance became a target. Characters began reacting to her with open disgust rather than mild inattention. The humor moved from something grounded in the universal to something specifically cruel. And the cruelty was directed at things Meg had no control over. You cannot change how you look. The early jokes about Meg were the jokes of a show that understood her as a character. The new jokes about Meg were the jokes of a show that had decided she was a punchline. The change in how the family treated each other was subtler but equally significant. In the first 3 seasons, the Griffins were dysfunctional in the way most families are dysfunctional, which is to say they annoyed each other, disappointed each other, and occasionally drove each other to distraction. But they came home to each other. Episodes ended with reconciliation. Peter would apologize, Lois would forgive, the children would make peace. The resolution might be imperfect, but it was genuine. In the revival seasons, that emotional resolution began to feel more perfunctory. The reconciliations happened because that is how sitcoms are structured, not because the writers were invested in them. The warmth that had made the early family dynamics feel real was starting to cool into something more mechanical. The Griffins were becoming a family that existed on a schedule rather than a family that existed with each other. None of this was irreversible in 2005 and 2006. The show was still good enough that the problems felt like rough patches rather than fundamental deterioration. If you had watched a Season 5 episode and a Season 2 episode back-to-back, you would have noticed differences, but you would not necessarily have concluded that the show was in trouble. The trouble was coming, though. And it would arrive wearing the uniform of a labor dispute and carrying a very specific kind of damage that would prove difficult to recover from. Seasons 4 and 5 of Family Guy were the last period in which the show could be described without qualification as good. Not great, the way the early seasons had been great, but genuinely worth watching, consistently entertaining, and occasionally brilliant. The talent was present. The characters were recognizable. The humor was more formulaic than it had been, but still creative enough to produce moments of real excellence. After seasons 6 and 7, that description would no longer quite apply. The cracks that were visible in the revival era were about to become breaks, and a real-world event that had nothing to do with comedy was about to make everything worse. Section 4. The Tipping Point, where good became inconsistent. Seasons 6 and 7, 2007 to 2009. There is a phrase people use in the television industry when talking about shows that have started to slip. They call it the moment the show crossed the line it could not come back from. Not every show has a single identifiable moment like that. For some shows, the decline is so gradual and so evenly distributed across seasons that there is no clean marker, no single episode or decision that changed everything. For Family Guy, there is a fair argument that the line exists somewhere between seasons 7 and 8, but the conditions that made crossing it possible were set up in seasons 6 and 7. Let us start with the strike. In November of 2007, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. This was not a minor labor action. It was a full work stoppage by thousands of television and film writers who were fighting for better compensation, particularly when it came to money generated by DVD sales and the emerging world of digital distribution. The studios and networks had been paying writers a fraction of a % of the revenue generated by these new formats, and the Luga had decided enough was enough. The strike lasted from November 5, 2007 to February 12, 2008, a duration of about 100 days that disrupted nearly every scripted show on American television. McFarland was a strong and consistent advocate for the writers. He had been since before the show existed. He joined the picket lines. He made it clear publicly that he stood with the Guild. He described Family Guy as something that belonged to the writers as much as to anyone else, and he was not going to undermine their action by working through it. Fox had other plans. The network made the decision to air several Family Guy episodes that had been completed before the strike began, doing so without McFarland's final approval or blessing. McFarland was, to put it mildly, unhappy about this. He described the decision in an interview with Variety as a colossal something deeply unpleasant, which in the sanitized version of this script we will simply call a deeply disrespectful move. He noted that Fox could legally do what they were doing, but that he found it genuinely damaging to the relationship between creator and network. He was right on both counts. The episodes aired. The strike continued. The production of new Family Guy material ground to a halt for months, and when the strike ended in February of 2008 and production resumed with the episode Back to the Woods, the show was different in ways that were hard to precisely identify but impossible to ignore. Television writing operates on momentum. A writer's room that is in the groove of producing a show has a kind of accumulated institutional knowledge, a sense of where the show is going and what it has already done, and what territory remains to be explored. That knowledge lives in the people in the room, and it lives in the rhythm of the work, the table reads, and the rewrites, and the conversations that happen in the hallway between meetings. When you stop that process for 100 days, you do not just resume it where you left off. The rhythm is broken. The momentum is gone. People have been away from the work long enough that returning to it requires a kind of re-entry that always costs something. Season 6 of Family Guy, which had begun in September of 2007 and was severely shortened by the strike, contained a two-part story that remains to this day among the most ambitious things the show ever attempted. The episodes were called Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, and they were everything that early Stewie had promised. In the first episode, Stewie finally carried out the central project of his first few years of existence and apparently killed Lois Griffin. In the second, Lois returned for revenge, having survived by extraordinary means, and the confrontation between the baby who had been plotting her death for years and the mother who refused to die was genuinely exciting television. These episodes were dramatic. They were darkly funny. They showed that the writers could construct a real narrative with real stakes when they chose to. Fans loved them. Critics praised them. They felt like a proper payoff to one of the longest-running jokes in the show's history, and then came the twist. The entire story had been a simulation running on Stewie's computer. None of it had actually happened. Everything reset to exactly where it had been before Lois was killed, before Stewie took over the world, before anything changed at all. On one level, the twist was clever. It was unexpected. It made a certain kind of sense, but on another level, it was a statement about the kind of show Family Guy was becoming. Not a show where things happened and had consequences, but a show where the appearance of things happening could be manufactured and then reversed without cost. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter was also, almost certainly, the last real showcase for the original version of the character. After those episodes, the world domination plots became rare. The attempts on Lois's life faded. Evil Stewie was, for all practical purposes, being retired. The episodes had served as both a celebration and a farewell, and the show had chosen to close that door. Season 7, which ran from 2008 to 2009, continued the trends that had been building through the revival era. The humor was shifting in a direction that traded cleverness for volume. In the original 3 seasons, Family Guy's dark jokes worked because they were sharp. They had edges. They came from a specific place and hit a specific target. By season 7, more and more of the comedy was coming from simply escalating things past the point of comfort and hoping the audience would interpret discomfort as hilarity. It is a form of comedy that can work, but it requires extremely precise execution, and the execution was becoming less precise. The characters were growing less consistent from episode to episode. Peter in one story would demonstrate enough self-awareness to recognize a mistake and try to fix it. Peter in a different story would do something genuinely harmful without any apparent awareness that he had done anything wrong. Brian's political commentary was becoming more prominent and less embedded in natural dialogue. The conversations were starting to feel like speeches. Lois, who had been the patient and reasonable center of the household, was beginning to show a harder, colder edge that felt less like character development and more like the writers struggling to find new angles on a character they understood primarily in relation to Peter. Season 7 produced some exceptional episodes. The road episodes featuring Brian and Stewie remained a reliable highlight. Individual scenes and gags were still capable of genuine brilliance. The voice cast was performing with the same skill they always had. But the ratio of strong material to weak material had shifted. More padding. More filler. More jokes that went on past their point of impact because the episode had time to fill and not enough story to fill it with. The Conway Twitty gag appeared for the first time during this era. For those who need the context, this was a recurring bit in which, instead of delivering a punchline or advancing the story, the show would simply cut to an unedited performance of Conway Twitty, the late American country singer, performing one of his songs. The full song, or a substantial portion of it, would play while the characters of Family Guy presumably stood somewhere off-screen waiting for it to be over. There was no commentary. There was no additional joke layered on top. The gag was simply the song replacing the comedy. The first time it appeared, the sheer audacity of it was somewhat funny. The second time, less so. By the fourth and fifth time, it had become the single most widely cited example of what critics and fans meant when they said Family Guy had stopped trying. It was 4 minutes of a show not doing the thing the show was supposed to do, and justifying that choice by calling it experimental. Seasons 6 and 7 were not disastrous seasons of television. They were inconsistent. They had highs that were genuine highs and lows that were genuinely concerning. They were the last seasons in which a reasonable person could argue that Family Guy was mostly still working. After season 7, that argument becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The cracks that were manageable in these 2 seasons would, in the seasons that followed, become something more fundamental. The golden era was behind the show. The question was how far behind. Section 5. The flanderization of Peter Griffin. From lovable fool to something much harder to love. There is a word that gets used in fan communities when describing what happens to a character after a show has been on the air too long. The word is flanderization. It comes from a character on The Simpsons named Ned Flanders, who began the series as a multi-dimensional friendly neighbor with a deep faith that was one of many things that defined him, and who over the course of many seasons was gradually reduced to a single trait, his religiosity, which crowded out everything else that had made him interesting. Flanderization is the process by which a character who started as complicated becomes simple, and then simpler, and then becomes a caricature of a specific single quality until the person they were at the beginning is unrecognizable beneath the repeated amplification of one note. Family Guy is, in the considered opinion of many critics and longtime fans, the single clearest example of flanderization in the history of American animated television. And no character on the show underwent a more dramatic transformation through this process than Peter Griffin himself. The Peter Griffin of seasons 1 through 3 was, at his core, a good man. This is the essential thing about him, and it is the thing that got lost. He was not intelligent. He was not responsible. He was not forward-thinking or measured or capable of consistently translating his feelings into appropriate actions. But he was good. He loved Lois with a completeness that was touching when the show let it be touching. He loved his children in the imprecise, fumbling way of a father who does not entirely know how to be a father, but tries anyway. He loved his friends at the Drunken Clam, Joe Swanson and Quagmire and Cleveland Brown, with the loyalty of a man who had found his people and knew it. When he hurt someone, he felt it. When Lois was upset with him, it mattered. The emotional ecosystem of early Peter was one where other people's pain registered. The comedy of early Peter was the comedy of a man whose reach exceeded his grasp in every direction. He would have ideas that were not quite good enough, act on impulse in situations that demanded restraint, and find himself in disasters that were entirely of his own making, at which point he would have to navigate the consequences of what he had done and figure out how to make things right. The making things right part was essential. It was the emotional reset that made each episode feel complete. Peter could be a disaster across 20 minutes of television, and as long as he ended the episode understanding what had gone wrong and caring about fixing it, the audience felt something warm. Not happy exactly, but warm. The process by which this Peter became the Peter of the later seasons was gradual enough that it is easy to miss if you were watching one episode at a time, but obvious in retrospect if you look at the full arc. In Season 4, Peter's intelligence began dropping in ways that exceeded comedic exaggeration, not just making bad decisions, which was always part of who he was, but demonstrating a level of basic incomprehension that the original character would not have possessed. He started doing things that were not just foolish but genuinely cruel, and the show began doing something that the early seasons had never quite done, letting him get away with it. The accountability loop that had closed every early episode, the moment where Peter understood what he had done and tried to repair it, began to grow shorter and less reliable. By Season 8, the transformation was well underway. By Seasons 10 through 14, it was complete. The Peter Griffin who existed from roughly Season 8 onward was a different character wearing the same clothes and speaking in the same voice. He was not a good man who made bad choices. He was something harder to categorize, a man who seemed to operate entirely without empathy, who could cause real harm to the people around him and then look at the camera and laugh. The specific examples are worth examining, because they are not exaggerations. They are things that actually happened on the show that was supposed to be a comedy about a funny family. In one episode, Peter and Lois are out on a boat when he sees a fin breaking the surface of the water. Peter's immediate response is to shove Lois underwater as an apparent offering to whatever might be coming, and then flee in the boat, abandoning his wife to what he genuinely believes is a shark attack so that he himself can escape. The fin turned out to belong to a dolphin. But that does not change what Peter did. He shoved his wife under the water and ran. Think about the Peter Griffin of Season 1, the man who told Lois he loved her at the end of every difficult episode, and try to imagine that man doing that. You cannot, because that man would have done something ineffective and probably counterproductive to try to protect Lois, not abandoned her as bait. The treatment of Meg, which we will discuss in its own section, was perhaps the most extreme expression of this transformation, but Peter's behavior toward all of his children deteriorated. He stole Halloween candy from Stewie, his own baby. He actively tried to undermine Joe Swanson's marriage by encouraging infidelity. He got Brian fired from a job out of jealousy and then attempted to avoid consequences for it. He did not learn lessons that stuck. When the show gave him a touching episode where he reconciled with Meg or understood his own cruelty, the next episode would reset everything to the cruelest factory settings. As if the writers were running two parallel versions of the show that did not communicate with each other. The physical violence associated with Peter also escalated dramatically. In the early seasons, Peter's physical comedy was cartoon slapstick. He fell. He crashed through things. He got into exaggerated fights with the giant chicken, which was spectacular precisely because it was so disproportionate and absurd. Everything was played for physical absurdity rather than genuine harm. In the later seasons, the violence associated with Peter became more graphic and more realistic. Injuries were shown with detailed anatomical accuracy that went beyond anything the early show had attempted. Characters sustained the kinds of wounds that in a realistic context would be life-changing or fatal. And the show presented these moments as comedic. The gap between cartoon violence and something more disturbing had closed in a way that made certain scenes genuinely unpleasant to watch. The Season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party, while not featuring Peter as the primary subject, contains the clearest articulation of what had happened to his character. In this episode, Meg Griffin reaches her limit. She gathers herself and delivers to her family a speech that lays out, in specific and accurate terms, exactly what she has endured and who is responsible. She tells Peter he is completely selfish and totally irresponsible as a father. She tells him he has no education and no real interests beyond his own immediate desires. She tells him that when he is not behaving recklessly in the community, he is a source of active harm in his own household. She describes specific behaviors. She tells him that if an outside observer could see how he treated her, he would be in legal trouble. Every single thing Meg says is true. It is not exaggerated. It is a direct and accurate description of things that Peter has done on screen, documented across multiple seasons of the show. The speech is not a satirical distortion. It is a factual summary. And Peter laughs. He does not feel shame. He does not feel hurt. He does not feel anything that would indicate the speech has registered as meaningful. He laughs. Because in his current form, nothing his daughter says to him carries weight. The early Peter would have been devastated by those words. He might not have fully understood all of them, might not have been able to immediately articulate a response, but he would have felt them land. He would have gone quiet in the way of a person who has had something true said to him by someone he loves. That moment of feeling things was the core of what made early Peter work as a character. The later Peter has no equivalent moment. He has been written out of the emotional register that made him human. His friendships with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland also suffered through this period. In the original run, these were friendships with depth. Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland at the Drunken Clam were men who had real camaraderie, who looked out for each other, who shared their lives in the way that neighbors and friends do. Joe Swanson, when he was introduced in the Season 1 episode A Hero Sits Next Door, was a genuinely admirable character. He was a police officer who had been paralyzed in the line of duty, and his courage and capability made Peter, who was jealous of how popular Joe was with the neighborhood, seem smaller by comparison. The joke of the episode was that Peter initially resented Joe's heroism before coming to genuinely admire it. In the later seasons, Joe became one of the show's most degraded characters. His disability shifted from a source of character complexity to a source of mockery. His wife Bonnie fell out of love with him in ways the show played for dark comedy. His friends, including Peter, frequently made him the butt of jokes rather than treating him with any vestige of the respect that the original version of the friendship would have implied. The man who was once the most admirable person in the neighborhood had become someone the other characters used as a punching bag. The arc of how Peter treats Joe mirrors the larger arc of who Peter has become. The man who was once capable of genuine admiration for a friend became a man who kicks his friends when they are down. What makes the flanderization of Peter Griffin especially painful is that the writers were clearly aware of what they had done. The Meg speech in Seahorse Seashell Party only works as a piece of comedy if the writers knew precisely how bad things had gotten. You cannot write that speech accurately without having been paying attention to what the show was actually depicting. The awareness was there. The decision to write that speech and then not do anything with it to have Peter laugh rather than feel, to reset the next episode without any residue of what Meg had said, tells you everything about the choice that was being made. Not that the writers did not know how far Peter had fallen, but that they had decided the fallen Peter was more useful to them than the recovery would be. Once a character becomes a reliable generator of shock and transgression, pulling them back toward decency costs you the shocks. And the shocks had become, in the later seasons, the primary currency of the show's comedy. The fanbase felt this. People who had once listed Peter Griffin as one of their favorite animated characters began talking about him in terms that ranged from disappointed to disgusted. The man who had seemed like a slightly more idiotic version of a real suburban dad, someone you could recognize and even identify with despite everything, had become someone you would not want to spend time with under any circumstances. Not funny enough to be enjoyable as pure spectacle, and not good enough to be enjoyable as a character. The damage that the flanderization of Peter did to Family Guy as a whole cannot be overstated. Peter Griffin is the show. He is the center around which everything else orbits. When the center becomes something the audience cannot connect with or root for, the whole structure of the show becomes compromised. You can still laugh at individual moments, individual cutaways, individual jokes that exist in isolation from character and story. But you cannot care about what happens to these people. Because the person at the middle of the story is no longer a person who inspires caring. Section 6. Brian Griffin, from the heart of the show to the most complicated character on it. If Peter Griffin's decline was the most damaging thing that happened to Family Guy structurally, Brian Griffin's decline was the most personally painful thing. Because Brian was the character the audience was supposed to actually be. Peter was the lovable fool who made you laugh because you recognized the type. Stewie was the genius villain who made you laugh because the concept was brilliantly conceived. Meg was the relatable teenager. Chris was the sweet-natured fool. Lois was the patient center. But Brian was the character you were supposed to identify with, the one who saw the Griffin household the way a reasonable, thoughtful person would see it, which is to say with equal measures of affection and exasperation. Brian was the audience's representative inside the show, the person who reacted the way you would react, who thought the things you would think, who was trying to make something of himself in circumstances that were not entirely conducive to self-actualization. In the early seasons of Family Guy, Brian Griffin was one of the most carefully and consistently written characters on American television. Not in the sense that he was the subject of rich narrative arcs, though he had those too, but in the sense that he felt absolutely real. He was a talking dog, a physical impossibility, but his interior life was recognizably human in the best and most complicated ways. Then came November 24th, 2013, and the episode called Life of Brian. In this episode, Brian is hit by a car while playing in the street with Stewie. He is taken to the veterinarian. His injuries are fatal. He dies on the table, with Stewie beside him, saying goodbye. The scene is genuinely sad. McFarland's performance as Brian in his final moments is quiet and warm, a reminder of who the character had been at his best. The Griffin family mourns. Stewie is destroyed. The show introduces a replacement dog named Vinny, an Italian-American character voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, and life continues without Brian. The fan reaction was extraordinary. Within hours of the episode airing, a petition on change.org demanding Brian's return had gathered tens of thousands of signatures and was growing at a rate that was, according to reporting from the period, among the fastest of any entertainment-related petition in the site's history. Social media was flooded. The death of Brian Griffin made national headlines. It trended online for days. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, Stewie uses a time travel device to go back and save Brian from being hit by the car. Brian came back. Vinny was gone. Everything reset. The backlash to the backlash was immediate and loud. Fans who had been genuinely emotional about Brian's death felt that the whole thing had been a trick, a ratings stunt designed to generate attention without the show having any actual willingness to follow through on its own narrative choices. McFarland later said that the creative team had been surprised by how intensely people reacted, saying that they had expected some reaction but not the level of rage they encountered. He acknowledged that the death had been a way to remind audiences that the show was capable of surprising them. The problem was the reversal. A surprise that gets immediately undone is not a narrative development. It is a bait and switch. The audience had been invited to feel something real, and then been told that the feeling was based on nothing, that the show had no intention of honoring what it had asked them to invest in. After Brian came back, any future moment of genuine emotional stakes in Family Guy was compromised, because the show had demonstrated that it would not hold to its own dramatic choices when they became inconvenient. After Brian's resurrection, he somehow became worse. The traits that Quagmire had itemized in his famous speech became even more pronounced. His selfishness reached new extremes. His cruelty to Stewie, the character who had literally died emotionally during the weeks Brian was gone and who had crossed time itself to bring him back, became harder to understand in any frame that made Brian sympathetic. The saddest part of Brian Griffin's story across all the later seasons is the occasional episode where the original Brian appears. Not as a consistent character, but as a brief visitor. An episode where Brian does something genuinely kind for Stewie. An episode where he offers Peter real and useful friendship. An episode where the warmth and intelligence and loyalty of the original version surfaces for a few minutes before the next episode resets everything back to the worst version. These moments prove something important. They prove that the writers knew who Brian was supposed to be. They had not forgotten. They could access that version of the character when they chose to. The deterioration was not accidental. It was a choice, repeated season after season, to make Brian more extreme rather than more interesting. To push his worst qualities further rather than allow his best qualities to breathe. The Brian Griffin who could have been one of the great characters in animated television history was there, just below the surface of the louder, meaner version. The show chose not to let him out. That is the real tragedy of Brian Griffin. Not that he changed, because all characters in long-running shows change, but that he changed in the direction of becoming less interesting rather than more, less warm rather than more complex, less like the dog that millions of people had connected with so completely that his death nearly broke them, and more like a collection of talking points and bad behaviors. Assembled in the shape of a dog. Section 7. The Stewie Problem. Losing the Evil Genius. When you ask people who watched Family Guy in the early years what they remember most vividly about the show, a significant number of them will mention Stewie Griffin before they mention anything else. The character was that singular. In a television landscape full of animated infants who were used for cheap comedy about the gap between their inability to communicate and the adult situations around them, Stewie was something that had genuinely never existed. A 1-year-old who had the vocabulary and rhetorical sophistication of a Victorian playwright, the tactical thinking of a military strategist, the moral flexibility of a supervillain, and the specific fixation of a person who has been profoundly wronged by someone and intends to settle the account. Personally, his target was Lois. His mother, the woman who fed him, changed him, sang to him, and was entirely unaware that the infant in her arms spent most of his waking hours plotting her demise with the earnest, methodical patience of a professional. The comedy of early Stewie operated on several levels simultaneously, which is why it worked as well as it did. On the surface level, it was simply absurd. A baby who talked like a Bond villain was funny in the way that absurdist premises are funny. In the way that putting two completely incompatible things together and playing them absolutely straight creates a kind of comedy that keeps generating laughter because the incongruity never quite resolves. Every time Stewie sat in his high chair and spoke about the inadequacy of lesser beings while Lois spooned baby food into his mouth, the joke refreshed itself, but underneath the surface absurdity was something more interesting. Stewie was competent. He actually built things. The ray guns were real and they worked. The time machine was real and it worked. The mind control device was real. When Stewie came up with a plan to eliminate Lois, the plan was thought through and might have succeeded under different circumstances. He was not a parody of a villain. He was a genuine villain who happened to be trapped in a situation, namely infancy, that he was managing with considerable ingenuity. And then there was the dramatic irony. Lois had no idea. She could not hear Stewie's speeches. Or, if she could, she registered them as baby babbling. She would hug him while he monologued about her imminent destruction. She would comfort him in moments of distress that were actually moments of strategic frustration. The audience knew what Stewie was. Lois did not. That gap, that persistent dramatic irony, gave every scene between Stewie and Lois a particular tension that was always funny because you were always waiting for the moment Lois would somehow realize what her baby was. A moment that never came. Brian was the only character who consistently understood Stewie and could have real conversations with him, which is how their friendship began to develop even in the earliest seasons. Their dynamic had a natural logic. Brian was the only adult in Stewie's life who treated him as an intellectual peer rather than a small mammal who needed to be fed and changed. The friendship was rooted in mutual recognition. In the second season, small hints of something different in Stewie began to appear. Moments of vulnerability. Brief flashes of what appeared to be gender exploration, handled as quick jokes rather than sustained character notes. Stewie worrying about how he looked. Stewie expressing something that resembled normal childhood longing underneath the armored exterior of villainy. These were, in retrospect, the writers testing a direction they were considering, seeing how audiences responded to a softer Stewie. In the third season, the balance shifted slightly more. The evil genius was still there, still planning, still building and scheming. But he was sharing more screen time with a version of himself that seemed genuinely conflicted, genuinely uncertain, genuinely searching for something that the world domination agenda did not quite satisfy. He was becoming a more complicated character, which is generally a good thing in storytelling. Then the show returned from cancellation in 2005, and the writers made a decisive choice. McFarland and the room had come to a conclusion that the evil baby joke had run its course. They felt they had taken it as far as it could go. In their assessment, continuing to produce variations on Stewie planning Lois's murder and building doomsday devices would make the character stale. So they made a conscious decision to phase out the evil genius and emphasize the other aspects of who Stewie was. The season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, was the official farewell to original Stewie, even if it was framed as a simulation rather than a real event. After those episodes, the world domination plots appeared rarely. The attempts on Lois's life became occasional references rather than active storylines. The weapons laboratory gave way to other preoccupations, and the new Stewie, the Stewie who was emotionally complex and identity-exploring and deeply invested in his friendship with Brian, took over completely. The writers would argue, and have argued, that this was legitimate character growth. that a one-dimensional villain becoming a multi-dimensional emotional being is exactly the kind of development that good storytelling should produce. They have a point. The new Stewie was capable of things the old Stewie could not do. The episode Christmas Guy, in which Stewie crosses time itself to save Brian's life after his death in Season 12, is genuinely moving. The love Stewie shows in that episode, the devotion that drives him to sacrifice himself in time to preserve the person he cares most about in the world, is real, and it works precisely because the character has been developed beyond his original premise. But the counter-argument is equally strong, and for many longtime fans, it is more persuasive. What the show lost when it retired Evil Stewie was something that cannot be replaced by emotional complexity, because the thing that was lost was irreplaceable in its specific category. Emotional complexity in animated characters is not rare. There are dozens of animated characters with rich inner lives and complicated relationships and genuine character arcs. They exist all over television, in animated form and live-action form both. Stewie as the emotionally intelligent, friendship-oriented, identity-exploring baby genius fits into that category with admirable execution, but without singular distinction. There was only one evil genius baby on television. There has only ever been one. The concept of a murderous, world-dominating, British-accented infant building laser weapons in his nursery while his oblivious mother sang to him was not just funny. It was genuinely original in the way that very few television concepts manage to be. It belonged to Stewie, and to no one else, and the writers retired it because they felt they had explored it thoroughly enough. The argument that the evil baby premise had been exhausted becomes harder to sustain when you consider that the show continued for, at time of writing, significantly more seasons with the softer Stewie than it ever produced with the evil genius. If the writers could find enough material to sustain the gentler version across 15 or more seasons, it requires a significant imaginative leap to believe they could not have found equally rich material in the original version. The evil genius was not a concept with one punchline. It was a concept with infinite potential directions. New inventions, new schemes, new targets beyond Lois, new alliances and enemies. The possibilities of Stewie growing older while remaining trapped in the same infant body. The possibilities of the world eventually taking him seriously as a threat. The writers chose not to explore those directions. The result is a Stewie who is entertaining in individual episodes, who can be genuinely funny and occasionally touching, but who no longer carries the specific charge of unpredictability and danger that made every scene with the original version exciting. Original Stewie was dangerous. He could do anything. Every scene with him had a crackle of energy because you never quite knew what insane thing he was about to say or do or build. Current Stewie is pleasant and capable. He is a good character. He is just not the irreplaceable character the original version was. The show gained warmth and emotional range when it made this change. It lost something it could not get back. There is a further element of the Stewie story that deserves direct discussion, and that is the way the show handled his sexuality and gender expression in the later seasons. From Season 4 onward, the show increasingly leaned into humor about Stewie's gender fluidity and same-sex attraction, which initially appeared as subtle notes in his character and then became, in later seasons, one of the most consistent running jokes associated with him. The character regularly cross-dressed, made explicit references to attractions toward men, and engaged in storylines centered around these aspects of his identity. The complexity here is that the treatment oscillated between something that might be read as genuinely exploratory and something that felt like the jokes were coming at the expense of, rather than in celebration of the character's identity. When the show used Stewie's queerness as a source of shame or ridicule, it read differently than when it was presented as simply part of who he was. The inconsistency in approach, with some writers clearly more thoughtful about it than others, meant that the humor around this aspect of Stewie ranged from genuinely interesting character exploration to something that felt like the show was still unsure whether to treat the material with dignity or deploy it as a punchline. What is clear is that Stewie's original defining characteristic, the evil genius, was replaced by a combination of emotional sensitivity and sexuality-focused comedy, and neither of those replacements filled the specific creative space that the evil genius had occupied. The show became something that had a Stewie in it. It no longer had the Stewie. Section 8. Meg Griffin, the character that became a punchline. Every long-running comedy has a character who receives more abuse than the others. It is a structural feature of the ensemble comedy format. You need someone to be the underdog, the butt of the joke, the character whose failures and humiliations generate comedy for the rest of the cast. When this is done with care, when the character's suffering is proportionate, and the show maintains some level of dignity for them even in their worst moments, it can work beautifully. When it is done without care, it becomes something more uncomfortable. What Family Guy did to Meg Griffin was not done without care. Exactly. It started carelessly and then became something much more systematic. Over the course of roughly 10 seasons, from the revival era through to about season 14, the show transformed its oldest daughter from a recognizable and relatable teenager into a repository for every unkind thought that the writing staff wanted to express through a human-shaped target. In season 1, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert, who left after that season due to conflicts with her schedule and her role on Party of Five. From season 2 onward, the role was taken by Mila Kunis, who has voiced Meg for the duration of the show's run since then. In the early episodes, Meg was a straightforward character. She was the Griffin family's oldest child, a teenager at James Woods Regional High School, unpopular in the way that teenagers who are not athletic or conventionally beautiful or socially dominant are unpopular, which is to say completely normally. She wanted to be liked. She wanted to fit in. She wanted her family to notice and appreciate her. The comedy of early Meg came from the contrast between her situation and the situations of the rest of her family. In a household containing a reckless father, a sophisticated and patient mother, an awkward but lovable brother, a murderous baby, and a philosophical dog, the ordinary teenage girl is going to seem unremarkable. That unremarkability was her character, and the show used it gently and with some sympathy. Meg was boring by Griffin family standards, and the joke was that boring was its own kind of burden when your family was everything but. This was a workable premise. It could have sustained a long-running character with genuine depth. Meg's ordinariness in an extraordinary family and her navigation of the gap between what she wanted from life and what her situation offered had real potential. The early seasons gave occasional glimpses of that potential. There were moments when Meg's perspective on her family was clearly and accurately the most sane perspective available, and the show honored that. And then the writers found that making fun of Meg got a reaction from the audience. And the reaction felt like success. And so they kept going. The shift began in season 4 and accelerated through seasons 5, 6, and 7. The joke stopped being about Meg being uninteresting and started being about Meg being physically unattractive and undesirable. Characters began reacting to her with open disgust that went beyond the mild inattention of the early episodes. Peter started saying things about Meg that were not the careless words of an inattentive father, but the deliberate words of a father who did not like his own daughter. The school environment became more extreme. The outside world joined in. By season 8, the dynamic had calcified into something that operated more like institutionalized cruelty than situational comedy. The entire Griffin family had aligned against Meg in a way that went beyond normal dysfunctional family dynamics and into something that read, when watched with any degree of critical attention, as a collective decision by the adults in the household to use the least powerful member of the family as an emotional release valve for their own frustrations. Peter farted in Meg's face for laughs. He shoved her. He made comments about wishing she did not exist. In one episode, a flashback revealed that Peter and Lois had attempted to abandon infant Meg at a fire station before she could walk, an act that the episode presented as comedic. The audience was supposed to laugh at the idea of parents trying to get rid of their baby. Lois, who in the early seasons had been Meg's primary advocate, shifted into a character who treated Meg with the cold contempt that Peter showed, removing the one parental relationship that might have offered Meg any counterweight to the abuse. The escalation was constant and consistent. There was never a plateau. Every season found new ways to make Meg's situation worse, new insults for Peter to deliver, new expressions of the family's contempt. The humor became less about Meg as a character and more about the audience's enjoyment of her suffering, which is a meaningful distinction. When you laugh with a character, even a character whose situation is difficult, you are sharing something with them. When you laugh at a character's suffering as entertainment divorced from their inner life, you have departed from comedy and arrived somewhere else. Mila Kunis, who voices Meg, has spoken publicly about encountering the specific dismissive line Peter frequently directed at Meg in real life, with people using it as a kind of greeting toward the actress who gave the character her voice. The fictional cruelty, repeated often enough, had been absorbed into the culture as a legitimate way to talk to a woman who reminded people of the character she played. The Season 10 episode, Seahorse Seashell Party, is the most discussed and most debated episode in the entire Meg storyline. And for good reason. In the episode, the Griffin family is confined to the house during a hurricane, and Meg, in a moment that feels inevitable given everything that has been building, finally says enough. She delivers to her family a speech that is raw and true and specific. She tells Peter what kind of father he has been. She tells Lois what kind of mother she has been. She speaks the accumulated truth of years of mistreatment in words that are not angry or theatrical, but simply accurate. It is a remarkable moment. For fans who had been watching Meg's situation deteriorate for years, the speech felt like justice. It felt like the show finally acknowledging what it had been doing and finding a way to give Meg back some of the dignity that had been systematically stripped from her. The audience wanted to believe that this meant something was going to change. What happened instead was this. When Meg pulled back from her role as the family's designated target, the family turned on each other. Without Meg absorbing the collective frustration and dysfunction of the household, the other Griffins had no common outlet for their worst impulses. And the damage that had been redirected toward Meg began ricocheting around the family without anything to catch it. The episode's conclusion is that Meg voluntarily returns to being the family's punching bag. She goes to Brian and accepts that her role in the family is to absorb what they cannot absorb themselves. She chooses to take it back on. The family returns to their equilibrium. The message of that episode, when you sit with it, is deeply troubling in ways that clearly bothered a significant portion of the audience. It is not that the episode is poorly made, because it is not. It is competently constructed and performed. But what it says is this: the victim of sustained abuse is responsible for maintaining the stability of the people who abuse them. The person who suffers is the load-bearing member of a structure that would collapse if they were not there to absorb the weight. And the correct response to this is for the suffering person to accept their role. Fans recognized this and were vocal about it. The episode is ranked among the most disliked in the show's history, not because it is badly executed, but because of what it chose to say about a character who deserved better. To be entirely fair to the show, the Meg situation did begin to improve around season 14 and 15. The addition of more women to the writing staff, who apparently pushed back actively against the sustained cruelty toward the show's main teenage girl, contributed to a shift in how Meg was written. She began receiving episodes where she was competent and interesting and fought back against the circumstances she found herself in. She developed something that resembled genuine agency. The worst of the abuse gradually stopped. By the later seasons, Meg had largely escaped the punching bag dynamic. But 10 seasons is a long time to spend systematically degrading a character. The damage to how audiences perceived Meg, and the damage to the show's own internal moral logic as it pertained to her, was done. Even the recovery could not entirely undo what had been built over that decade of sustained cruelty. Meg Griffin remains the clearest proof of what Family Guy lost when it stopped caring about the people inside it. She had been set up as a character who could have been genuinely moving, a teenage girl with a big heart navigating an impossible family with grace and resilience. The show chose to make her a target instead. And somewhere in the gap between what she could have been and what she was used for, you can see exactly where the show's priorities shifted. Section 9. Cutaway gags, from the show's greatest strength to its most visible weakness. If you have watched even a small amount of Family Guy at any point in the show's history, you know what a cutaway gag is. A character says something that contains a comparison or a reference. The words "this is worse than the time," or "it reminds me of when." And then the screen cuts away from whatever is happening in the main story to a brief disconnected scene that illustrates the comparison before cutting back. The disconnected scene might be 8 seconds long or 3 minutes long. It might be brilliantly funny or completely tedious. It might connect to the original line in a way that rewards attention, or it might be so loosely associated with the setup that the connection is essentially ornamental. This format is Family Guy's most recognizable feature. It is what people think of first when someone mentions the show. It is the thing that most of the most shared clips online are drawn from. The brief self-contained sketches that can be extracted from their episode context and circulated independently, generating views and reactions from people who may never have watched a complete episode of the show in there. Lives. It is also the format that, in the later seasons, became the clearest single indicator of a writing room that had run out of story. To understand what happened, you have to understand what cutaway gags were in the early seasons and what they became. In seasons 1 through 3, cutaways functioned as bonus comedy. They were not the comedy. They were added to the comedy. An episode of Season 1 Family Guy had a real story, a beginning and a middle and an end. Characters who moved through that story in ways that generated humor and occasionally touched something emotional, and dialogue that was funny on its own terms. The cutaways supplemented all of that. They were the unexpected extra joke, the 30-second tangent that played with a concept before the story moved on. You could, theoretically, remove every cutaway from an episode of Season 1 and still have a funny, well-constructed half-hour of television. The cutaways made the episodes better. They were not what made the episodes function. Starting with the revival in Season 4, the relationship between story and cutaway began to shift. It shifted slowly at first, imperceptibly from one episode to the next. But the direction was consistent, and it was always in the same direction. More cutaways. Longer cutaways. Plots that existed primarily as structures on which to hang cutaways rather than as ends in themselves. Characters who delivered setup lines not because the lines fit the scene, but because the setup line was the mechanism for triggering the next disconnected joke. By the middle of the show's run, somewhere around seasons 8 through 12, a typical Family Guy episode had a plot that occupied perhaps 10 of its 22 minutes, with the remaining 12 minutes filled by cutaways of varying length and quality. The plot was not really a plot in any meaningful narrative sense. It was a scaffolding. A loose frame that justified the presence of characters in a general location, while the show cut away repeatedly to jokes that had nothing to do with anything happening. South Park addressed this directly in their 2-part episode Cartoon Wars from 2006. In those episodes, series creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's comedy as being produced by a committee of manatees randomly selecting idea balls and combining them to produce jokes. The point was that the cutaways were not the product of creative thinking about story and character, but of random association, and that you could substitute any cutaway with any other cutaway without changing anything meaningful about the episode, because none of the cutaways were connected to anything meaningful. The criticism was sharp and not entirely fair, because the early Family Guy cutaways were not random in the way Parker and Stone depicted, but for the later seasons the criticism landed with growing accuracy. The Conway-Twitty gag deserves extended attention because it became such a precise symbol of what the critics were pointing at. Conway-Twitty was an American country singer who died in 1993. He had a distinctive voice and a devoted following, and a catalog of romantic country songs that were beloved by his audience. He had absolutely nothing to do with Family Guy in any conceptual sense. The gag was this: at certain moments in later episodes, rather than delivering a joke or advancing the story, Family Guy would cut to an unedited performance of Conway-Twitty performing one of his songs. Not a short clip. Not a parody. An actual performance, several minutes long, playing while the viewer watched and waited for it to end. The first time this happened, it had a kind of audacious absurdity that generated a reaction. It was genuinely unexpected. It demanded the audience's attention precisely because it refused to give them what they had come for. There was a reading of the gag in its first appearance as an avant-garde comedy gesture, a Dadaist refusal of expectation that commented on the nature of television entertainment. The third and fourth times it appeared, that reading was no longer available. The gag was just a several-minute hole in the episode where nothing happened. Critics and fans pointed to it as the clearest possible evidence that the show was using its runtime to avoid producing content. When you were filling your episode with unedited Conway-Twitty performances, you have communicated something important about your relationship with the work. The show knew this. One of the more fascinating aspects of Family Guy's later seasons is its self-awareness about its own failures. An awareness that it expressed through jokes rather than through actual improvement. In the Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot, Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode of the show. While observing the pilot, they notice that during a cutaway, the characters in the episode are standing around in awkward silence, waiting for the cutaway to finish before they can continue with what they were doing. It is a genuinely funny observation about the structural absurdity of the cutaway format. It is also, when you watch it in context, a confession. The show is telling you that it understands exactly what the cutaways do to its characters, which is leave them with nothing to do. And it is making a joke about that rather than addressing it. The episode Cutaway Land, which was produced as a kind of meta-celebration of the cutaway format, had the opportunity to be the show's greatest engagement with its own legacy. Peter and Lois discover they can travel between cutaways, treating the disconnected gag universe as a real place. It could have been a brilliant piece of animated comedy that honored what the cutaway did best while also acknowledging its limitations. Instead, it consisted largely of recycled cutaways from earlier seasons and ended with the entire premise being revealed as a dream. The show chose the most tired possible structure, a dream sequence undoing everything, for the episode that was supposed to be the definitive statement on its most distinctive feature. What makes this situation particularly frustrating is that the show kept producing evidence of how good it could be when it chose to abandon the cutaway dependency entirely. The Season 8 episode, Brian and Stewie, is the most frequently cited example. In this episode, Brian and Stewie get accidentally locked together in a bank vault overnight. There are no cutaways. There are no random gags. There is nothing in this episode except two characters sitting in a confined space and talking to each other about the things that actually matter in their lives. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box, that he has thought about using it on himself, that the depression he carries is more serious than he has ever acknowledged. Stewie reveals what Brian means to him in terms that are simple and devastating. The episode is, by common agreement among fans and critics, one of the best things the show ever produced. It is raw and honest and unguarded in ways that the cutaway-heavy episodes can never be. Because you cannot be raw and honest in a format that constantly interrupts itself. The episode demonstrates that Family Guy did not need the cutaways to be compelling. It needed good writing and characters it had invested in, and those things could generate an episode of genuine power without a single random gag. But Brian and Stewie was the exception. The vast majority of later Family Guy episodes relied on cutaways as their primary comedic engine. The stories got thinner. The character interactions got shorter and less interesting. The episodes became sequences of disconnected jokes, loosely connected by a plot that did not go anywhere in particular. You could watch a late-season Family Guy episode and laugh at 2 or 3 individual moments while being unable to tell someone what the episode was about 5 minutes after it ended. The broader implication of the cutaway overload connects to everything else that happened to the show. When you spend the majority of your episode on disconnected jokes, you have no time to develop character. You have no time for the kind of family interaction that generates warmth. You have no time for the emotional beats that make the comedy feel earned rather than gratuitous. The warmth of the early seasons, the sense that these people cared about each other, could not survive in a format that prioritized random gags over character moments. The cutaways did not just replace the comedy, they replaced the heart. Section 10. Seth MacFarlane steps back, the creator leaves his creation. There is a pattern in the history of long-running creative works that is so common it might almost be considered a law. The creator of something builds it with their own hands, guided by a specific vision, bringing to every decision the particular intelligence and sensibility that made the original thing worth making. The work becomes a success. The success creates opportunities beyond the original work. The creator pursues those opportunities. And the original work continues, now guided by people who understand it very well and love it genuinely, but who are not, and can never be, the person who built it from the ground up. What you get in almost every case is something that continues to function without quite functioning the way it originally did. Not because the new stewards are less talented or less caring, but because the specific vision that drove the original work is not transferable. It lives in one person, and when that person moves on, it goes with them. Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy represent one of the clearest examples of this pattern in American television history. In the early years of the show, MacFarlane was everywhere. He was not simply the creator. He was not simply the voice of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, 4 of the show's central characters. He was in the writer's room. He was reading scripts and offering notes. He was involved in the animation decisions. He was present at the table reads where episodes first came to life. He had opinions about everything, and he expressed them. And the show reflected those opinions in every frame. The co-showrunner Alex Sulkin, looking back on this era in an interview, described MacFarlane's presence in the room as something close to a superpower. When MacFarlane was in the writer's room pitching jokes, he was pitching them in the actual voices of the characters, which meant the room could immediately hear whether something landed or not. You could not just write a joke on paper and wonder how it would sound coming out of Peter Griffin's mouth when MacFarlane was sitting across the table from you, doing Peter Griffin's voice. The immediate auditory feedback was, Sulkin noted, like a cheat code for the writing process. In his own words, during a Reddit AMA in September of 2017, MacFarlane confirmed that he had not been writing for the show since 2010. He had stepped back from the writer's room at that point, choosing to focus on production and voice acting. He still read scripts. He still had notes. He was not absent from the show's production, but the day-to-day creative direction, the story breaking, the joke writing, the decisions about where characters were going and what the show wanted to be, that had passed to other hands. The timing of this is significant. The shift in Family Guy's quality that becomes most apparent and most sustained starts around season 8, which was produced beginning in 2009. The creative direction McFarland had provided through his active participation was beginning to thin out, and the consequences of that thinning were becoming visible in the work. McFarland's attention in the period following his withdrawal from the writer's room was genuinely elsewhere. In 2012, he wrote, directed, produced, and starred in Ted, a live-action comedy film about a man whose childhood teddy bear had been magically brought to life and remained his best friend into adulthood. Ted earned over $500 million at the worldwide box office on a production budget of approximately $50 million, making it one of the most commercially successful comedies of the decade. In 2014, he followed it with A Million Ways to Die in the West, a Western comedy in which he also starred. Ted 2 came in 2015. In 2017, he created, produced, wrote, and starred in The Orville, a science fiction television series that premiered on Fox before moving to Hulu, which became one of the most earnestly beloved science fiction shows on television in years. In 2024, he produced a live-action Ted prequel series for Peacock. By any standard, this is an extraordinary body of work in a remarkably short period. McFarland had become one of the busiest and most creatively ambitious people in the entertainment industry, and Family Guy was one line item on a very full schedule. The people who ran the show in his absence, Rich Apple and Alex Sulkin, who co-show ran the series together from season 16 onward as a formal arrangement, though they had been central to the production for much longer, were by all accounts highly capable television professionals with deep knowledge of and genuine affection for the show. In interviews, Appel described the writer's room he and Sulkin maintained as a good place to work, with people who had relaxed into their comedy after years together and were producing material with a sense of ease that the more competitive early room had not always had. He also noted that McFarland, despite not being in the room, still reads every script, still offers notes, still, from time to time, identifies something that should not be there and removes it, replacing it with something better. The presence of the creator, Appel said, is still felt, even from a distance. This is credible and almost certainly true. McFarland's involvement, even attenuated, is not zero. But there is a meaningful difference between a creator who reads finished scripts and offers notes and a creator who is in the room when the scripts are being built. The notes on a finished script relationship catches things that are wrong. The in-the-room relationship prevents things from going wrong in the first place. McFarland's relationship with Fox, the network that had canceled his show twice and then rode it to extraordinary commercial success, became increasingly strained over the years. He was a politically liberal person who was openly uncomfortable with the show airing on a network associated with Fox News. In August of 2021, he posted publicly on social media about Tucker Carlson, the Fox News host, saying that Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network. He went further, describing his relationship with Fox as a failing marriage and noting, in a reference that was clearly intentional, that he had been having an affair with NBC. The NBC reference was to the $200 million overall deal McFarland had signed with NBC Universal in January of 2020, a deal that moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, entirely out of the Fox ecosystem and into the Comcast family. His new projects were being developed for platforms that had nothing to do with Fox. His future was at another address. Family Guy was the thing that kept him contractually present at the old one. In April of 2024, McFarland gave an interview in which he discussed the show's continued existence with a candor that was more illuminating than perhaps he intended. He said he did not see a good reason to stop making the show because people still enjoyed it, that it made them happy, and that it helped fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation through organizations he supported. He acknowledged there had been a time when he thought the show should wind down, but said it had reached what he called escape velocity, a state of momentum where the show had been going long enough that there was no logical stopping point as long as the audience was still there. He did not mention exciting new stories he wanted to tell. He did not mention creative directions he was eager to explore. He did not describe the show with the language of a person who is passionately invested in what it is becoming. He described it with the language of a person who is managing a successful ongoing enterprise and is satisfied with its existence but not particularly energized by it. Compare this to the McFarland, who had stood in a Fox executive's office in 1998 at the age of 24, with a 15-minute pilot and $50,000, and an idea for a family that was unlike any family on television. And you can feel the distance between who he was then and where. The relationship with this project had arrived. In April of 2025, it was announced that Family Guy had been renewed for 4 additional seasons in what was described as a mega deal with parent company Disney, which now owned the Fox Entertainment properties. The deal extended the show through season 27 and the television season of 2028 to 2029, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes, 30 years. The show that premiered in 1999 to 22 million viewers would still be in production in 2029, watched by a fraction of that audience on a night of the week it was not originally designed for, produced by a team of dedicated professionals guided from a distance by a creator who had long since built his future elsewhere. The creative heart that made Family Guy extraordinary in its first 3 seasons cannot be manufactured. It existed because one person had a specific vision and the passion to execute it and the presence to guide it. When that person was actively there, the show was something. When he stepped back, the show continued, competently and professionally and with occasional genuine excellence. But it continued as a thing maintained rather than a thing pursued. Section 11. The ratings freefall, what the numbers say. Numbers do not require interpretation. They are what they are. And the numbers that describe Family Guy's ratings history tell a story that is simultaneously the most objective and the most damning account of the show's decline. The show's premiere in January 1999 drew 22 million viewers on the strength of the Super Bowl lead-out. The first season averaged 12.8 million households, ranking the show number 33 in the overall Nielsen ratings. These were not spectacular numbers for a broadcast network show, but they were solid for a new animated comedy, and they represented a genuine audience that had found the show and come back to it week after week. The second and third seasons suffered from the scheduling problems we have already discussed, and the ratings declined as a result of Fox's continuous shuffling of the time slot rather than any problem with the show itself. But the decline was still a decline. When the show returned in 2005 for season 4, the revival premiere drew approximately 11.87 million viewers. This was extraordinary given that the show had been off the air for 3 years. The audience had not forgotten. They had been waiting. The revival was a genuine success by every measure. Season 4 averaged 7.9 million viewers across its run, which was the realistic baseline for a revived show without a Super Bowl to boost its premiere. These were good numbers. They demonstrated that the cult following built through Adult Swim and DVD sales was real and substantial. From that point, the decline was slow and then fast and then very fast. Season 13, which aired in 2014 and 2015, averaged 5.86 million viewers. The show had lost roughly 2 million viewers in the span of 9 seasons from the revival high point. A decline, but not a catastrophic one. Something was still drawing people back. Then the steepening began. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million viewers with a 0.45 rating in the adults 18 to 49 demographic that advertising rates are built around. Season 23, The most recently completed full season at the time of significant reporting averaged 723,000 viewers with a .19 rating in the same demographic. Take a moment with that last number. 723,000 viewers. For a show that had once been watched by 22 million people in a single night, for a show that had been one of the most discussed, most viral, most culturally present animated comedies in the history of American television. Less than 750,000 people were watching new episodes of Family Guy on a given night. That is a loss of more than 96% of the peak audience. 96% of the people who watched that Super Bowl premiere in 1999 had, by season 23, left. Not all of them at once, and not permanently, because the show still drew audiences on streaming platforms and in reruns on Adult Swim and FXX. But as a live broadcast event, as a show that people planned their Sunday nights around, Family Guy had become nearly invisible. The network's response to this decline was visible in the scheduling decisions. For most of its run, Family Guy was a central anchor of Fox's Sunday animation domination lineup, the block that had been built specifically to feature the network's most successful animated comedies. Family Guy had been a marquee name in that block for years. In 2019, the show was moved from its longtime 9 o'clock Sunday position to the 9:30 position. A small move, but a signal. In the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, Family Guy and Bob's Burgers were removed from the Sunday animation domination block entirely. When Family Guy returned to the Fox schedule, it was placed on Wednesday nights. Wednesday night is not where you put a flagship program. Wednesday night is where you put something that you want to give a home without investing it with the prestige of your best nights. The move from Sunday to Wednesday was, by any standard reading of television scheduling, a demotion. The irony of this is almost operatic when you consider the show's history. In 2009, Family Guy was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series, the first animated program to receive that nomination since The Flintstones in 1961, nearly 50 years earlier. A show that had twice been canceled was now being considered for the highest honor in American television comedy. In 2013, TV Guide ranked it among the greatest television cartoons ever made. These achievements happened within living memory of many of the show's fans, and they happened to the same property that was now averaging 723,000 Wednesday night viewers. The question that immediately presents itself is why, with these numbers, the show keeps getting renewed. The answer is economics, and it is an answer that illuminates something important about the entertainment industry. Animated shows are cheap to produce relative to live-action programming. There are no location costs, no expensive sets, no wardrobe departments, no union lighting crews. The voice actors record their lines in a recording booth. The animation is produced largely overseas. The whole operation is, by network television standards, lean. A show that pulls barely 700,000 viewers in its first-run broadcast might still be generating substantial revenue through streaming rights on Hulu, syndication on Adult Swim and FXX and Comedy Central, merchandise licensing, and the kind of passive income that a catalog of 400+ episodes generates over years and decades. Family Guy as a business proposition is not primarily about how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. It is about the entire ecosystem of content the show has built over 25 years. And that ecosystem remains valuable regardless of what the Nielsen numbers say about the current season. Disney, which acquired the Fox Entertainment properties and now owns Family Guy, is not making the decision to renew the show for 4 more seasons because it is creatively thriving. It is making that decision because the spreadsheet says the show generates more revenue than it costs to produce. This is not a cynical observation about Disney specifically. It is simply the economic logic of content in the streaming era. Shows exist as long as they generate value above their cost. Family Guy does, and so it continues. But there is something worth sitting with in the gap between the show that the numbers describe today and the show that pulled 22 million viewers on a January night in 1999. Family Guy is not in decline because animated shows inevitably decline. It is in decline because of specific choices made by specific people across specific seasons. The show chose what it became piece by piece, and the audience responded to those choices by gradually leaving. The numbers are just the record of that conversation. Section 12. American Dad did it better. The most uncomfortable evidence of all. There is a particular kind of argument that is almost impossible to counter, and it is the argument by demonstration. You can tell someone that a show did not have to decline the way it did, that the decisions that led to its current state were choices rather than inevitabilities. And they can argue with you. They can say that all shows decline over time, that creative fatigue is universal, that nothing can stay great for 25 years. They have a point, partially. But then you point at American Dad, and the argument changes. American Dad premiered on February 6, 2005, just a few months before Family Guy returned for its fourth season. It was created by Seth MacFarlane, Mike Barker, and Matt Weitzman, and it aired on the same network, in the same animation domination lineup, on the same night. It followed a suburban family. Stan Smith, a fiercely patriotic, somewhat paranoid CIA agent in Langley Falls, Virginia, his wife Francine, their children Haley and Steve, a CIA program alien named Roger living in their attic, and Klaus, a German-speaking goldfish who was actually a man whose brain had been transplanted into a fish's body by the CIA during the Cold War. On paper, it sounded like a slightly more extreme version of Family Guy, another animated family sitcom from the same creator, another show about a dysfunctional household in an American suburb. Critical reaction was mixed in the early going. The first season leaned so heavily on political humor, Stan's extreme conservatism colliding with Haley's progressive activism, that it felt one-note and obvious at times. Nobody was calling it the better show in 2005. Most people who watched it did so because it aired right after Family Guy, not because they were specifically seeking it out. American Dad was widely dismissed, in those early years, as a lesser sibling. And then it got better. Considerably, consistently, measurably better. While Family Guy was going through the flanderization and the cutaway overload and the declining character dynamics and all of the other things we have discussed, American Dad was doing something different. It was learning. It was growing. It was developing its characters with care and building stories with structure. The single most consequential structural difference between American Dad and Family Guy is the one that has been most frequently noted by critics and fans. American Dad does not use cutaway gags. This one decision reshaped everything about how the show works. Without cutaways as a fallback, the writers had to make every episode function as a complete story. Every joke had to come from character and situation. Every funny moment had to be earned through the plot. There was no mechanism for escaping a story that was not working by cutting away to something unrelated. This forced the writing staff to become better storytellers. They had to think about narrative structure, about how comedy emerges from specific character dynamics in specific situations, about how to build an episode that generated laughs not through random disconnected gags, but through the accumulation of well-constructed comic situations. The discipline of working within a format that required real story construction produced, over time, a show that was fundamentally more satisfying to watch from beginning to end than Family Guy in its later seasons. Stan Smith started as a one-dimensional political caricature and became, across the show's run, something much more interesting. He remained deeply flawed, remained conservative to his bones, remained capable of startling cruelty and startling obliviousness. But he also became someone who could grow, not permanently and not without setbacks, but genuinely. Episodes where Stan confronted his own failures and changed, even slightly, in response to them produced comedy that was also moving. A combination that the later Family Guy had almost entirely abandoned in favor of comedy that was only shocking. Roger the Alien is the most elegant demonstration of how American Dad solved the character problem that Family Guy stumbled over. Roger had the ability to adopt different personas, essentially becoming entirely different characters with different names, different backstories, different relationships to the world. This gave the writers an inexhaustible well of material. Every episode could feature a new version of Roger, and the personas could be anything the writers imagined, with no limit on genre or tone or style. The concept was designed to constantly evolve, which meant the character never went stale. Compare this to what happened with Stewie, who was reduced from a specific, irreplaceable original concept to a softer, safer, more generic animated character. The writers of American Dad found a structural solution to the problem of long-term character freshness. The writers of Family Guy retired the freshness and replaced it with something more familiar. Francine Smith maintained the character she had been established as throughout the show's run. Haley and Steve grew and changed in ways that felt natural rather than forced. The Smith family, for all its weirdness and dysfunction, maintained the core quality that the Griffin family gradually lost. They liked each other. Not always. Not without conflict, but fundamentally, underneath the chaos, the Smiths were a family that wanted to be together. That warmth, which is the most difficult quality to maintain in a long-running comedy, survived in American Dad in ways it did not in Family Guy. When American Dad moved from Fox to TBS after its 11th season, a move that many people feared might be the beginning of the end, the opposite happened. The new home gave the writers more freedom, and the show responded with some of its best material. The move that felt like a demotion turned out to be an opening. American Dad on TBS produced seasons that fans and critics consider among the strongest in the show's entire run. Meanwhile, Family Guy's move from its longtime Sunday night position to Wednesday evenings felt like exactly what it was: a slow contraction toward irrelevance. The show that had once anchored the most prestigious animated comedy block on television was now filling a midweek slot with the modest ambitions of something that is being maintained rather than something that is being built. The comparison is uncomfortable for anyone who loved Family Guy in its peak years, because it removes the easy excuse. You cannot say that all shows eventually fail. American Dad has not failed. You cannot say that Seth MacFarlane's sensibility does not translate to long-running comedy. American Dad proves that it does. You cannot say that animated family comedies inevitably run out of material. American Dad demonstrates that they do not have to. What you are left with is a simpler and more troubling conclusion. Family Guy declined because of the choices that were made about it. The choice to push Peter past the edge of lovability into cruelty. The choice to let Brian become a fraud and a hypocrite. The choice to retire evil Stewie. The choice to make Meg a punching bag for a decade. The choice to let cutaways replace storytelling. The choice to value shock over cleverness. The choice, perhaps most importantly, to continue producing the show after the creative energy that had made it extraordinary had moved on to other projects. American Dad exists as proof that these were choices, not inevitabilities. A show created by the same person, in the same studio, in the same era, airing on the same network to the same audience, made different choices and arrived at a different destination. One show became better as it aged. The other became something harder to love. Family Guy was once a genuinely great show, not great in the qualified way of something that is good for what it is, but great without qualification. A show with something to say and the craft to say it. It was one of the most innovative and influential pieces of American television comedy in the first 2 decades of this century. The fact that it is not that thing anymore does not diminish what it was. The golden age was real. The brilliance of those first 3 seasons and the best moments of the revival era are real. They exist on record and they can still be watched, and they are still funny and sometimes still moving. But the story of what happened to Family Guy after those first 3 seasons is ultimately a story about what happens when the people responsible for something stop protecting it with the same intensity that created it. When the writer steps back from the room. When the characters stop being people and start being delivery mechanisms for shock. When the story stops being the point and the joke becomes the only point. When the audience that stayed for the characters has to settle for the cutaways because the characters have gone somewhere they cannot follow. The golden age ended. Not with a dramatic finale or a creative crisis or a single catastrophic decision. It ended the way most golden ages end, which is gradually and then all at once, replaced by something that wore the same face but had lost the thing that made it shine. Section 13. What the golden age meant, and why it still matters. It is possible to sit here and think about all of this. The flanderization, the cutaway overload, the ratings decline, the characters who became caricatures of themselves, the creator who moved on and come away feeling only loss. Like being asked to meditate on the gradual erosion of something beautiful, ending with nothing to hold. But that is not quite right. And it is worth saying why. Family Guy in its golden age was genuinely significant television. Not just as a popular show, but as a piece of creative work that changed what animated comedy could be. Before Family Guy, the dominant model for American animated comedies for adults was The Simpsons, which had established a format centered on character and story and warm-hearted satire of American suburban life. The Simpsons is a masterpiece, and it deserves every word of praise that has ever been written about it. But Family Guy was doing something different. It was faster, stranger, more aggressive in its comedy, less interested in narrative satisfaction, and more interested in the dense accumulation of sharp moments. It pioneered the viral clip format before viral clips existed as a category. It created a visual language for absurdist comedy that influenced decades of animated work that came after it. It demonstrated that an animated sitcom could go places that live-action network television could not, and that the audience would follow. The characters at their best were genuinely memorable. Peter Griffin as a lovable fool, capable of real warmth despite genuine idiocy, was a character that millions of people recognized something of in their own family lives. Brian Griffin as the aspiring intellectual who was also a loyal and sometimes heartbreaking friend was a character whose specific sadness landed precisely because it was so recognizable. Stewie Griffin as the evil genius in the yellow shirt was one of the most original creations in television comedy of any era. A concept so specific and so committed that it worked as pure invention. The show's best episodes were not merely entertaining. Some of them were actually good television in the fullest sense of the term. The kind that stays with you, that you quote years later, that you put on when you want to feel the specific warmth of something that made you laugh when you were younger and needed the laugh. That legacy is real, and it is not diminished by what came after. The decline does not reach backward and infect the peak. The golden age was what it was. The choice to love what it was does not require you to pretend that what came after was something other than what it was. What the story of Family Guy teaches, if it teaches anything, is about the fragility of creative quality. It teaches that the conditions required to produce extraordinary work are specific and not easily reproduced. That they depend on people and on timing and on a particular alignment of passion and talent and presence that cannot be maintained indefinitely and cannot be reliably recreated once it has dispersed. It teaches that audiences feel the difference between work that is being made with genuine investment and work that is being produced by professionals meeting a schedule. Not always consciously, not always in ways they can articulate, but the feeling is there, and it registers in the numbers and in the conversations people have about shows years after the golden age has passed. And it teaches that the decision to keep a great thing going past the point where the greatness can be sustained is always, at some level, a decision about something other than the work itself, about money, or about habit, or about the difficulty of saying a definitive goodbye to something that was once so alive you could not imagine it ending. Family Guy will keep being made through season 27 and to 2029, and perhaps beyond. Seth MacFarlane will keep voicing Peter and Brian and Stewie and Quagmire in a recording booth somewhere in Los Angeles. Rich Apple and Alex Sulkin will keep breaking stories and running the room with the care and professionalism they have always brought to the work. The Griffin family will keep living on Spooner Street and making each other's lives difficult in ways that generate YouTube clips and Reddit discussions and the particular nostalgic warmth that comes from spending time in a fictional world you have known for 25 years, and somewhere in the archive of those first 3 seasons. In the rough and slightly handmade animation of episodes like A Hero Sits Next Door and Lethal Weapons and Mr. Saturday Night and Love Thy Trophy, the original versions of these characters still exist. Peter, who meant well and felt bad when he hurt someone. Brian, who was genuinely smart and genuinely loyal. Stewie, who was dangerous and unpredictable and brilliant. Meg, who was just trying to be noticed. Lois, who was holding everything together with grace and patience. Chris, who was sweet and confused in the way that adolescent boys so often are. Those characters are still there, unchanged, exactly as they were on that Sunday night in January 1999, when 22 million Americans sat down after a football game and were introduced to a new kind of animated comedy. The golden age that ended is also the golden age that will not end, because it exists in the permanent present tense of a recorded thing, available whenever you want to return to it. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the loss is not quite as complete as it sometimes feels, because the thing that was lost can still be found, not in the current episodes, and not in the middle seasons where the decline was most visible, but in the place where it started, where everything was still being built and cared for and shaped by someone who had not yet run out of things to say about this funny, warm, chaotic family on Spooner. Street. That is where the golden age lives. And it is still there, waiting. If you made it to the end of this one, genuinely thank you. This is the kind of content that takes a long time to put together and is most meaningful when it finds the right audience, which is people who care about the shows they watch and want to understand them more deeply rather than just consume them. If Family Guy was part of your life at some point, if you know exactly which episode you watched first or remember staying up to catch it on Adult Swim at 2 in the morning during your college years, leave that in the comments. I read every single one. Like this video if it kept you company tonight. Subscribe to the channel if you want more long-form explorations of the shows and worlds that matter to people who take stories seriously. I'll see you in the next one. Supplemental section. The humor that stopped being clever. Shock value and what it cost. There is a meaningful distinction between dark humor and shock value that is easy to understand intellectually and surprisingly easy to lose track of in practice, especially when you are producing 22 episodes of television per season under deadline pressure for a decade and a half. Dark humor takes something uncomfortable and finds a way to make it funny through craft. The discomfort is not the joke. The discomfort is the raw material that the writing shapes into something with an actual punchline, a twist, an observation, a perspective that changes how you think about what you just saw. When dark humor works, the laughter it produces is complicated. It carries something with it. an acknowledgement of the thing that was uncomfortable, and the relief that comes from having that acknowledgement made with skill and wit rather than solemnity. Shock value, by contrast, is the shortcut. It presents something extreme and waits for the audience to react. The extremity is the payload rather than the setup. There is nothing underneath it except the extremity itself. No craft, no perspective, no insight that the shock was designed to deliver. When shock value works, which it sometimes does, it works because the audience was genuinely surprised. When it does not work, you are left with nothing except the discomfort, with no comedy to justify the trip. Family Guy's early seasons understood this distinction precisely. The show was frequently offensive in ways that prompted complaints and watchdog organization condemnations. It made jokes about religion, about race, about disability, about sexuality, about politics, about topics that network standards departments found troubling and that advocacy groups found objectionable. The Parents Television Council put the show on its worst programs list multiple times. The Federal Communications Commission received petitions asking that it be blocked from broadcasting. But in those early seasons, even the most controversial material generally had something underneath it. The offense was a delivery mechanism, not the content itself. A joke about religion that actually had a point about religious hypocrisy or human self-deception was different from a joke that was just offensive. The show understood the difference. Starting around season 8 and accelerating into the show's middle and later run, that distinction began to blur, and then to dissolve. The show started reaching for extremity, because extremity was faster than cleverness, and faster was necessary when you needed to fill episodes at the rate the schedule demanded. Graphic violence began appearing not as occasional punctuation in a comedic story, but as a primary source of comedy in itself. The descriptions of injuries became more detailed, more anatomically specific, more concerned with the visual impact of harm for its own sake. Peter Griffin was often at the center of this shift. The physical comedy that had always surrounded him, the falls, the crashes, the giant chicken fights that were spectacular precisely because they were so wildly disproportionate and cartoonishly exaggerated, evolved into something with a different quality. Where the early physical comedy had been about the absurdity of exaggerated consequence, the later physical comedy was about the graphic specificity of injury. And the two things are not the same. The giant chicken fights themselves are a useful lens for examining this evolution. The first giant chicken fight in the Season 2 episode Da Boom was genuinely spectacular, an extended sequence of escalating combat that worked because of its total commitment to absurdist escalation. It was funny because nothing like it had ever appeared on animated television before, because the scale of the conflict was so wildly inappropriate to its origins, and because the show executed the escalation with genuine comic timing. The many giant chicken fights that followed across the show's run became progressively more elaborate and more graphic while generating progressively fewer genuine laughs, because repetition destroys the element of surprise that made the original work, and no amount of additional production value can compensate for the loss of genuine novelty. The show's approach to cultural humor also degraded across this period. Early Family Guy made jokes about ethnicity, nationality, religion, and culture that were frequently stereotypical but that generally had a comedic structure underneath the stereotype, some observation or twist that justified the use of the familiar image. Later Family Guy often dropped the structural justification entirely and simply pointed at a cultural characteristic and waited for the laugh. The difference between a joke about a group and an observation about a group is the difference between comedy and catalog, and in the later seasons the show increasingly produced the latter while calling it the former. The political humor followed the same trajectory. Family Guy had always had a political voice, and it had always been a liberal one, which is the voice that McFarland brought to the show personally and that most of the writing staff shared. In the early seasons, this political voice was expressed through comedy that was actually about something, that identified a hypocrisy or an absurdity in American political culture and found a way to make the identification funny. In the later seasons, the political content became more like commentary, more direct, less filtered through comedic craft. Brian Griffin, whose political positions had always been liberal, stopped being a character with political views and became a vehicle for liberal positions stated without the mediation of actual comedy. The entertainment value and the argument had been separated, and the argument was appearing without the entertainment to carry it. When McFarland himself is interviewed about the show's humor, he consistently defends it as being in the tradition of satirical comedy that goes back to Jonathan Swift and Mark Twain. This is not wrong as an aspiration. Swift and Twain did write things that were genuinely offensive, and that were genuinely making a point through their offensiveness. But the comparison only holds for work that actually has the satirical point. When a show that once had the satirical point loses it, the comparison becomes an argument from inheritance rather than an argument from achievement. What the shift from dark humor to shock value cost Family Guy was audience trust. When viewers know that the comedy is going somewhere, that the uncomfortable setup is going to resolve into something that justifies the discomfort, they stay with the show through the rough moments. When viewers come to understand that the uncomfortable setup might just be the discomfort itself, presented for its own sake, they begin to leave. Not all at once and not consciously, but the withdrawal happens, and the ratings record documents it with precision. Supplemental section. The supporting cast and the world that shrank. One of the things that made early Family Guy feel alive and full was the supporting world around the Griffin family. The show populated its fictional Rhode Island town with characters who had their own distinct personalities, their own comedic logic, their own relationships to the main family that generated situations and jokes that the show could return to reliably. Joe Swanson was the police officer neighbor in a wheelchair, originally written as a man whose disability was one aspect of a complex and genuinely admirable character. His introduction in the Season 1 episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, was one of the most effective character introductions in the show's history. Peter's initial jealousy of Joe's popularity and heroism, and his gradual recognition of Joe as a genuinely good person worth admiring, set up a friendship that felt like it was built on something real. Joe was capable, tough, and respected, and his wheelchair was part of his story rather than the joke of his story. Glenn Quagmire, whose status in the show's universe as an aggressively sexually motivated character was established from the beginning, functioned in the early seasons as a comedy archetype that the show used with enough self-awareness to prevent from becoming simply offensive. Quagmire's obnoxiousness was played against his genuine friendship with Peter and the other men at the Drunken Clam. And the balance between his absurd behavior and his real human connections gave the character dimension that a simpler deployment of the character type would not have permitted. Cleveland Brown, before he was given his own spin-off show in 2009, was the most grounded and warm-hearted of Peter's three friends. A counterpoint to Quagmire's aggressive energy and Joe's stoic heroism. A man whose fundamental decency made him the character most likely to say the thing that acknowledged when something had gone too far. In the later seasons of Family Guy, all three of these characters degraded. Joe became primarily a vehicle for disability jokes and then a vehicle for marital unhappiness jokes, losing the dignity that had made him interesting when the show was investing in him as a character. Quagmire became primarily the character who hated Brian, a storyline that was initially interesting because of what it revealed about both characters, but that went on past its productive life and became simply a running conflict that recycled itself without development. Cleveland departed for his own show, which was canceled in 2013, and when he returned to the main cast, his presence felt obligatory rather than enriched. The supporting town around the Griffins, which in the early seasons had felt like a real community with its own texture and internal logic, became thinner and less interesting as the show aged. The characters who had served as background players became background fixtures. The town itself, which had once felt like a specific place with a specific character, became a generic backdrop for whatever story needed to be set somewhere. The shrinking of the world around the Griffins was both a cause and a symptom of the show's larger decline. When you stop investing in the supporting cast, you reduce the possibilities for story. When the story possibilities are reduced, you reach more frequently for the cutaway to fill the time that story is not filling. When you rely more heavily on the cutaway, you invest even less in the supporting cast and the world, because cutaways do not require that world. The cycle feeds on itself. The best long-running comedies maintain their worlds with care across their entire runs. The Simpsons, which has its own complicated relationship with its later seasons, built and populated Springfield across its early years with a richness that has sustained the show's universe for decades. American Dad built Langley Falls with similar care. Family Guy's fictional Rhode Island town was fully realized in the early seasons and progressively hollowed out as the show continued. What was once a place became a backdrop. What were once characters became props. The specificity of the world was traded away, piece by piece, for the convenience of not having to maintain it. Supplemental section. The Simpsons comparison A&D what it tells us. Any comprehensive discussion of Family Guy's decline has to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is The Simpsons, the show that Family Guy was most frequently and most unfavorably compared to from its inception. Critics who dismissed Family Guy in the early years often did so by calling it a lesser version of The Simpsons, which was not entirely fair, but was not entirely baseless either. Both shows were animated comedies about working-class American families in fictional northeastern towns. Both featured a bumbling husband and a patient, long-suffering wife. Both used the animated format to pursue comedy and satire that would have been harder to execute in live action. McFarland bristled at the comparison throughout the show's history, insisting, with considerable justification, that Family Guy was doing something fundamentally different from what The Simpsons was doing. That the cutaway format and the density of cultural references and the specific anarchic energy of the show distinguished it clearly from its predecessor. He was right. Family Guy at its best was not The Simpsons. It was its own thing. But The Simpsons is also a useful comparison point for thinking about decline. The Simpsons had its golden age too. Widely understood to run from around season 3 through season 8 or 9, a stretch of television that is considered by many critics to be among the greatest bodies of work in the history of the medium. And then The Simpsons declined, and discussions of its post-Golden Age seasons carry their own complicated feelings for people who grew up watching it. The difference is that The Simpsons at its worst is still, generally speaking, recognizable as a show made by people who care about it. The characters retain their essential humanity. Homer Simpson, who also underwent flanderization across the show's long run, is still recognizably the same person he was in season 3, just pushed harder in some directions. The warmth at the center of The Simpsons has never entirely disappeared. It has thinned in later seasons to something closer to a habit than a living quality, but it is still there. Family Guy at its worst became something that felt genuinely cold. The warmth did not thin. It left. The Griffins stopped feeling like a family in any meaningful sense, and became a collection of characters who shared an address and occasionally a scene. The show stopped being about anything except its own surface, and the surface was harder and colder and meaner than the early show had been. This difference in how the two shows aged reflects something about the specific vision that drove each of them. The Simpsons was built on a foundation of genuine humanity, of the belief that the most ordinary and imperfect people are worthy of attention and affection and comedy. That belief is embedded deeply enough in the DNA of The Simpsons that it persists even when the execution has become formulaic. Family Guy was built on something sharper and more aggressive, and sharpness and aggressiveness are qualities that require constant investment to remain interesting. When the investment declined, what was left was not warmth under the edge, but just the edge itself. And an edge without purpose is just something that cuts. And that, in the end, is the story of Family Guy's golden age. And what ended it? Not a single moment, not a single failure, not a single person or decision or circumstance that can be pointed to as the culprit. A collection of small changes, each of which seemed manageable in isolation, that accumulated across seasons into something that was genuinely different from the original. A creator who stepped back from something he had built from the ground up for completely understandable reasons, at a moment when the show needed his specific creative presence more than it knew. A writing staff that worked hard and cared genuinely but could not quite reproduce the particular alchemy of those first 3 seasons. Characters who were pushed past the point where their audiences could follow them. An audience that left, slowly and then quickly, until only a fraction of the original number remained. The golden age of Family Guy was real and it was rare, and it mattered to millions of people who laughed at it and loved it and refused to let it die when a network canceled it twice. That golden age belongs to the people who experienced it, and no subsequent decline can take it away. But it is over. And understanding why it ended, in the careful and honest way we have tried to do here tonight, is its own kind of tribute to how extraordinary it once was. Sleep well. Supplemental section. The voice cast and the silent constant. One thing that is easy to overlook when cataloging everything that changed about Family Guy across its long run is the one thing that never changed at all, and that is the voice cast. Seth MacFarlane, Alex Borstein, Seth Green, and Mila Kunis have been the voices of Peter, Brian, Stewie, Quagmire, Lois, Chris, and Meg respectively for the show's entire history, with the exception of Meg's first season under Lacey Chabert and the replacement of Mike Henry as Cleveland Brownby. Arif Zahir in 2020, a change Henry requested himself. The core performers have remained. This is actually somewhat remarkable for a show that has been on the air for more than 25 years. Voice actors age differently than on-screen actors, which is one of the structural advantages of the animated format. The characters do not change physically because they do not have to correspond to how the performers look, and the performers can continue indefinitely as long as their voices remain capable of the work. But even accounting for this advantage, the loyalty of the cast to the show and the show to the cast across such an extended period represents something genuinely stable in the midst of all the other changes. McFarlane voicing 4 primary characters, each with a distinct personality and vocal quality, is a performance feat that deserves to be stated plainly. Peter Griffin sounds like Peter Griffin. Brian Griffin sounds like Brian Griffin. Stewie Griffin sounds like Stewie Griffin, and Quagmire sounds like Quagmire, and none of them sound like each other despite coming from the same person. The technical skill involved in maintaining those distinctions across hundreds of episodes across decades is considerable, and it is so consistent that viewers rarely think about it as an achievement. They simply accept that these are the voices of these characters, which is the highest compliment you can pay a voice actor. Alex Borstein as Lois has similarly maintained one of the most specific and recognizable character voices in animated television. A voice that carries both the exasperation and the warmth of the character simultaneously, that can shift from frustrated to loving within a single line reading in A way that is the vocal equivalent of a skilled physical comedian's body language. The work is invisible in the way that all truly excellent craft is invisible, but it is there in every episode, supporting whatever the writing gives it. When the writing was at its best, in those first 3 seasons and in the strongest episodes of the revival era, the voice work had material worthy of it. The performances in those episodes have a naturalness and a specificity that you do not always notice until you compare them to episodes where the writing is weaker and the same performers are doing what they can with less. The voice cast was always doing the work. The question was always what the work was asking them to do. This is worth mentioning not because it softens the assessment of the show's decline, but because it complicates it appropriately. The people who showed up to record Family Guy every week for 25 years brought their full professional abilities to the work every time. The craft of performance never declined in Family Guy. What declined was the material those performances were serving. The actors were never the problem. The actors were the consistent excellence that the rest of the production sometimes did and sometimes did not deserve. There is something quietly poignant about that consistency. McFarland still walks into a recording booth and becomes Peter Griffin, a character he created when he was 24 years old and has inhabited now for more than a quarter of his life. The relationship between a voice actor and a long-running character is something unusual and difficult to fully describe from the outside. The character is not the actor, but the character would not exist without the actor, and after enough years the two become entangled in ways that are professionally complicated and personally intimate. Peter Griffin has been part of Seth MacFarlane's life for longer than most marriages last. Whatever you think about where Family Guy ended up, whatever you think about the choices that were made with the characters and the stories and the comedy, the voice work remained a form of devotion. 4 voices, consistent and true to who these characters were supposed to be. Even when the writing was not honoring that truth, the cast held the line in the one way they could hold it, which was to keep showing up and keep doing the work with the same craft they had always brought to it. In the long accounting of what the show lost and what it kept, that consistency belongs in the kept column. And it is not a small thing. Final supplemental note on what nostalgia asks of us. Before we finish tonight, there is one more thing worth saying, and it is about the nature of nostalgia itself and what it asks of us when we carry it. Nostalgia for Family Guy's golden age is a real and legitimate feeling, shared by millions of people who watched those early seasons at specific moments in their lives, and for whom those episodes are inseparable from the context in which they first appeared. The college dorm room at midnight, the living room couch on a Sunday, the laptop screen in a quiet apartment. The show became part of the furniture of people's lives. And when it changed, when the furniture was rearranged, the loss was personal as well as creative. But nostalgia is most useful when it is honest, when it acknowledges what was actually great about the thing it is mourning, rather than simply mourning the thing as it was, including the parts that were not great. The early seasons of Family Guy were not perfect. The first season had rough edges. Some jokes did not land. Some episodes were weaker than others. The show was finding itself, as all shows do, and the finding process was visible in the work. What nostalgia should do, ideally, is help us understand what was actually worth preserving and what was not, so that when we think about what was lost, we can be precise about it. What was lost was the warmth, the accountability, the sense that these characters were people rather than vehicles. The craft in the comedy, the jokes that came from something rather than pointing at something. The creative investment of a person who cared enormously about every decision. Those things were real and they were valuable, and they are worth mourning. The rest, the rough animation, the occasional weak episode, the jokes that already felt dated in the second season, those things are not what nostalgia should be for. Nostalgia should be accurate. It should remember the thing that mattered and set aside the things that did not. Family Guy at its best was something worth being nostalgic about. The characters were real and the comedy was sharp and the heart was genuine. It earned the love it received, and the love it received was enormous and it was real. The rest of the story is just the rest of the story. Which is to say, it is what happened, not what had to happen. And knowing the difference between what happened and what had to happen is the beginning of understanding it. Rest well tonight. Thanks for being here.